Chapter 7. Just going to talk about the general information that leads to economic growth and automation here. And going to start with economic growth. So essentially, what is economic growth? Well, it's that growth in real GDP. So we've distinguished between real and nominal GDP. And here as well, we're actually talking about real GDP per capita, which was one of the things I said to watch out for when we were in Chapter 5. We've seen that in Canada over the past 100 years, that real GDP per capita has gone up by roughly 2% per year over this whole time period. So average income doubles every 35 years. So average income today is about 8 times higher than it was a century ago. Income per person in Canada is 6 times higher than it is in China and 12 times higher than it is in India. This idea of our income being greater than theirs will have an impact in terms of future growth potential. And we'll kind of see how that works. Okay. So what leads to this economic growth? Well, productivity is the main factor. The quantity of goods and services produced from a factor input is our productivity. So if we get more productive with that same extra worker, with that same extra oven, our productivity is greater. So typically technology and other things like that lead to greater productivity. So with greater productivity, the more we can produce, the more we can enjoy, and the more we have economic growth. The determinants of productivity here is physical capital per labor, human capital per worker, and natural resources and technological knowledge. Physical capital per worker is essentially, if you're thinking about a kitchen, it's the amount of ovens that a worker has, it's the amount of machines, cutting boards, knives, and other things like that, roads. It has a big impact because if you've taken microeconomics before, you'd see that a crowded space leads to a diminishing marginal product of labor. Well, very few working a crowded space leads to that problem, but also having too much of this and not enough workers is also a problem. Human capital per worker is the knowledge and skills possessed by workers acquired through education, training, and experience. So essentially this is, if we could think about, this is the education years, whether it's through work or through school. And the thing that people mix up with is this technological knowledge. So here, it's the society's understanding the best way to produce a good. So here, this is all the knowledge that you can acquire engineering school or other schools. But even though that knowledge exists, if the population that you have doesn't go through school, you can't transmit that information to them. So the technological knowledge needs to be there, but within that society, human capital per worker also needs to get it. So if you think about certain countries that are a little bit poor, they can still have access to technological knowledge because this knowledge can be available. Like textbooks that we use in Canada are not hidden from people elsewhere, and they could also come to get educated here. But it's the amount of money that's invested in their actual education that's lacking. Natural resources is another one. If there's not enough natural resources or just like raw materials and stuff like that, there's going to be limits to productivity. So those are the main determinants. But as I said, there's just marginal productivity is diminished as you limit one of them. So if you have a certain amount of ovens and you add more and more people in the kitchen, that more and more extra worker, even though they're equivalent expertise and equivalent human skills, they won't produce as much because they won't have access to as much capital. Or in the other case, having a fixed size kitchen but adding more and more devices will increase, but after a while the effect will be quite minimal. So it's just something to keep in mind that sometimes in your society you need to invest more to increase productivity a lot, and sometimes you might need to invest in human skills or other things like that instead. So it's not always just increasing the amount of capital. But if we could get more economic growth, we have more efficiency, we have more production. What about fairness and equity? Well, sadly, we can have a lot of economic growth without it being distributed all over. So it doesn't necessarily lead to help for the poor, and that's where some of the social programs may exist. Different public policies to encourage economic growth. Well, if you think about all the factors of economic growth that we saw, whether it's things that relate to education or through development of technology, which would be our technological knowledge, or encouraging saving and investment, because we're going to see that savings leads to investment and investments in capital. And encourage free trade also can be good to promoting technologies and moving them around. So different things like that typically lead to a society that grows faster. And we're pretty lucky here in Canada or in Quebec that we have good education, pretty cheap education, even though some people might complain, which is good for society. You want to have that in a society for it to be productive. So that's discussion on economic growth. I don't need you to know anything beyond that. The equations are done at a higher level. At this level, just have a general grasp of the idea that there's different factors of production out there. If you invest only in one, you're going to increase production to a certain extent, but you really want to invest in all of them. And if you think of countries such as China and India, they might be able to grow faster because as soon as you give them a bit more capital, since there's so many workers out there, they're able to become a lot more productive. So they have a very high population level to very low capital to labor ratio compared to us. If you give them a bit more capital, their productivity can jump really rapidly, whereas us, we have quite a lot of capital, so it's not necessarily what's going to contribute as much. And the next discussion we'll have, brief discussion, is on automation.